Unless you've been living under a rock for the past 7 years, you probably know about Grand Seiko. In 2017, they split from Seiko to become their own brand. However, before that, they were still part of the Seiko brand, and going back even further, there were some very interesting pieces. Welcome to Addicted to Watches. Today, we're looking at another fairly obscure, or at least less common, watch. It's almost old enough to be called vintage, coming from 1978, and it comes from a time when things were made a bit different. While maybe not rivaling luxury watches of today, at the time, this definitely was, and can still more than stand on its own 2 feet. This is a 1978 Seiko Grand Quartz. That's right, Seiko Grand Quartz. Not quite the Grand Seiko quartz we know and love today, but this certainly was the equivalent at the time. These days we associate the word grand with the best Seiko has to offer, ignoring Creedor for a second. Back in the 70s, when this was made, that was also the case, but there was also a range of other tiers to the Seiko quality ladder. Sitting directly under Grand was King Quartz, and below that Lord Quartz, before finally getting to the regular production models with Superior and Twin Quartz, as well as their standard movements. Being from the top of the line, the construction and craftsmanship evident on this watch is done to the standard you'd expect. Very high. A slight spoiler for later, but this watch has the best pressed clasp I've ever seen. The rest of the watch is of course also well made and solid, as we'll come to see. When this was made, just 10 years after the very first quartz watch, it was still a relatively new and expensive technology. Enough time had passed for there to be developments and refinements to the technology, and this watch is a testament to that, ticking along happily some 46 years later. One thing about Grand Seiko, and vintage Seiko in general, is that they have a very much understated sense of style. The look is classic and timeless. It looks just as good today as it did when it was made. So, continuing that thought, let's take a look at the design of this one a bit more closely. It's a very simple, straightforward design. The hour markers are applied batons with a painted black top surface. Where polished indices would disappear in some lighting conditions, these are pretty much always visible. There are, however, some slim polished chamfers to catch the light and help them stand out just that bit more. You have to get really close to see just how fine those chamfers are, and it's a reminder of the high level of craftsmanship that went into the watch. The marker at 12 is just slightly wider than all of the others to give it presence at the top of the dial. At 3, a marker has been foregone to make way for a date complication, and so instead we have an applied frame around it. This frame has an inner bevel and reveals the white date wheel beneath. The minute track is a simple set of printed lines for each minute. No half, quarter or fifth of a second is printed, just what's necessary. Above the pinion is the Seiko logo, which has been applied, while the model range, Grand Quartz, is printed underneath. Moving below the pinion, there is this odd-looking applied emblem. It signifies the twin quartz movement inside, and is an illustration of the quartz oscillation. Twin quartz refers to Seiko's thermocompensation technologies in the watch, which maintain accuracy to within 10 seconds per year, a level that even today is impressive, let alone almost 50 years ago. Very small below that is another emblem, one you might recognize from the dial of my Grand Seiko SBGR 311. This is the symbol of the Daini Seikosha factory, where this watch was produced. The dial itself, though, is a very slightly metallic champagne colour that is not too overbearing and gives the watch a subtle but classy look to it. There is also a very small, very fine texture to the dial that really elevates it. There were other models in the line with plain dials, but I think that this one is much better looking and much more interesting for it. The hands of this watch mimic the hour markers in that they too have a black painted top surface running their length. Just like it did for the indices, it keeps the hands legible where polishing wouldn't. They are quite narrow overall, but don't feel small. I think the black section on the hands helps to give them more presence on the dial. As that silver second hand ticks around the dial, you'll notice 2 things. The first is that it hits all of the minute markers, a sign of a good quality quartz movement. The other is that there is very little, if any, bounce or wobble after each tick. Newer Grand Seiko quartz movements have a two-step motor to eliminate any wobble, and while I'm not sure that this movement does too, the ticks definitely feel very solid and confident. I'd like to tell you about the crystal covering the dial, but I don't know too much about it. Considering that this watch was made well before I was even born, I of course bought it second hand, so I don't even know if it's the original crystal for the watch. What I can tell you about this crystal is that it's seen better days. It's got more than its fair share of scratches, and one particularly deep one from 9 to 5. But really, it's a flat crystal that sits completely flush with the bezel, and even seems to have some anti-reflective coating. Judging by the scratches, I think it's a safe bet to say that it's some kind of mineral crystal rather than sapphire. If we zoom out a little more, we come to a case with some very wearable, very vintage dimensions. For the case diameter, at its widest we have 35.5mm, which sounds small, but it does wear larger than that might suggest. Being quartz, thickness is also very good at 8.7mm, and lug to lug is kept in check by very short, squared lugs at 41.7mm. Between the lugs, it's good to see that Seiko have been consistent at least with weird sizes for their Grand line of watches, since this one is 19mm. That said, it's kind of irrelevant since the first link of the bracelet flares out anyway. Looking at the case, we can really see a lot of the classic elements of Grand Seiko design language on display. We have distinct, flat surfaces creating sharp, strong lines along the case, a mix of very finely finished surfaces both brushed and polished, and an almost effortless feeling of simplicity yet refinement. There is a simple polished bezel surrounding the dial. It's multifaceted with a flat top before transitioning into angled sides. This bezel really catches and plays with the light nicely. The upper surface of the case is more or less flat and has been brushed vertically, which contrasts against the bezel. The side of the case are made up of two large angled polished surfaces that remind me a bit of the 44GS case. The top and sides, however, are broken up by another thin bevel running the length of the case. Even after all these years, you can see just how sharp and crisp those lines and transitions on the case are. Looking side on, and we are presented with a very small, slightly recessed crown that has been signed with the twin quartz emblem again. Considering how accurate the watch is, you won't be needing to use that crown very much other than to change the date every other month. It of course doesn't screw down, and neither does the press-on caseback, leaving this watch with just a water-resistant rating. I wouldn't be giving that rating much weight anyway, and don't really think any vintage watch should be taken near water. A neat little feature on the caseback is the battery hatch that makes changing the battery incredibly easy when the time comes. It's a feature that many swatches and other brands still use today. The last thing to mention is the bracelet. We already know it's 19mm at the case, and we also know that the clasp is actually very good too. You might have noticed that the bottom end link has a small chunk missing from it, creating that gap with the case. I've got as much idea as you do as to what happened or what could have caused it. The end links are hollow, but the links themselves are solid, single piece links that fit together quite intricately. It kind of reminds me of some of the very complicated, very precise Japanese woodworking joinery techniques, though not nearly as tricky as those are. The short links mean it wraps around the wrists very nicely as it tapers to just 15mm at the clasp. On a side note, I think a 4mm taper is perfect for just about any strap or bracelet. 19 to 15, 20 to 16, and 22 to 18. It just makes them so much more comfortable to wear. Now, the clasp is just pressed, and just friction fit, but it is very solid, very tactile, and very satisfying. There is no looseness at all, so the manufacturing tolerances were very tight, and though the steel may be relatively thin, it's reassuringly stiff and strong. There is no micro adjustment in the clasp, but that's not really a concern when the individual links are so small. A very small but important detail here, which really goes to show the attention to detail that went into the watch, is the shape of the piece of metal that keeps the clasp closed. Where most others have a C-shaped piece that snaps over the other side of the clasp, this has more of an S shape to it. So, the clasp actually closes in 2 stages and feels fantastic in action. The last thing to do is get it on wrist and see how it wears. I don't have any other 19mm straps, so we'll just be looking at it on the bracelet. But it's a very good bracelet, so I probably wouldn't be changing it out anyway. All of the polished surfaces and accents on the watch catch the light in subtle ways as I turn my wrist. The color of the dial also shifts a little depending on the light. Turning my wrist, you can see just how thin the watch is and how smoothly the bracelet wraps around it. I mentioned earlier that there is a larger presence on wrist than the 35.5mm case size suggests, and I think you'll agree that on my 7-inch wrist, it looks right at home. A combination of the more squared case shape and the bracelet flaring out slightly helps in that regard. Also, the fact that it's a vintage watch, and they generally look good when on the smaller side, doesn't hurt either. So, I've had a lot of good things to say about this watch, and that's because it's a really good watch. The scratches on the crystal aren't really something I can complain about, and there isn't really anything I dislike about the watch. It's a clean, simple, good-looking, accurate, high-quality watch that is more of a subtle flex for those in the know. The only downside? Finding one in the first place. If you look online, there are some, but they can be few and far between, or priced a little high. But if you keep an eye peeled and an ear to the ground, you might just be able to find a hidden gem from Seiko's rich history of making watches. What do you think about this watch? Do you have a vintage Seiko in your collection? Would you change or complain about anything on this one? Am I reading too much into it, and it's just an old quartz Seiko? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.